The truth of the matter is, in terms of enforcement and border security, this has been the most aggressive president that we have seen. Right? So here I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. Department of Homeland Security has different branches. We have the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which deals with green cards and legal status and so on. But we have Customs and Border Patrol, and then we have ICE. They have somewhat different jurisdictions. So Border Patrol, these are the people that are supposed to intercept you as you cross the border or at the airport or whatever. And ICE is if you're in the country, if you've been in the country for longer, right, or if you're deeper in the interior of the country. We have a bunch of tools. 287G agreements actually deputize the police to do the job of immigration agents. That's what we had in Arizona, right? And actually the Justice Department, through their investigation about what's been going on down there with racial profiling, they have revoked their 287G agreement with Arpaio. We also have CAP, Criminal Alien Program, if you're already in the system, if you've gotten into trouble at the moment that you're released, let's say from jail, or that you've served your probation, your information is sent to ICE and you're going to get deported, right? So it's kind of like a double jeopardy. Also, we have Secure Communities Program, known as SCOM. That means every time, anytime you have contact with the police, you're taken down to the station, your fingerprints are taken. They're not only sent to the FBI, but also to ICE. Right? ICE will put a hold on you if there's a positive match, and then you're going to go into deportation proceedings. The reason why that's problematic is because it has nothing to do with innocence or guilt. This does not happen after you've had your day in court and you've been found guilty. It can happen as easily as you being pulled over at the traffic stop, and because you are brown or because you have an accent, them taking you down to the station on some kind of suspicion, right? And then as soon as you're down at the station, you can end up in deportation proceedings. Also with Border Patrol defines its jurisdiction as 100 air miles from the border. Over 97% of New York State is within the jurisdiction of Border Patrol. If you're looking 100 miles from the coast, 100 miles from Lake Ontario, 100 miles from the St. Lawrence, and in that area, which the ACLU has called a de facto constitution-free zone, protections against unlawful search and seizure do not apply. Okay, and in that zone, Customs and Border Patrol can ask anybody for their papers. And that includes us right here. And that's why we've had a lot going on in terms of buses being boarded, trains being boarded, and these are not trains and buses going to Toronto, right? Let's say they're going from New York to Chicago. Here's the ACLU map. As you can see, that 100-mile zone, because a lot of major cities are in the coast, 2 out of every 3 people living in this country are, in fact, in that constitution-free zone. Right? So that's how the power of the federal government has been expanded. And this is from an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that came out maybe a year or so ago. Routine boarding, right? Rochester, New York is one of the most aggressive spots in the entire northern border. I think in 2010 it was, they arrested well over 1,000 people, and over 90% of them were from trains and buses, and the vast majority of them had been in the country for more than a year. In other words, it has nothing to do with protecting the border. It has nothing to do with intercepting people as they're coming into the country. Advocacy groups have been active. Reform Immigration for America in 2010 organized a march. I think in New York State alone we brought 10,000 people, and these are just the buses that we know, right? These are people we've counted on the buses, not people who also took their cars privately down. Just from New York State alone we had at least 10,000 people down in DC. Probably 200,000 people. It just happened to be on the same day that the health care reform bill was passed in the House, so that's what got the media attention. You know, there was relatively little on us here demonstrating in D.C. And again, Obama promised to work on comprehensive immigration reform. Advocacy groups, and we have hundreds of them in New York State, continue to provide individual services to immigrants, and that's not going to stop, regardless of what the political climate is, right? Providing legal aid services, or providing translation services, or ESL classes. I mean, there's a whole range of support services that advocates provide. But also, and that of course intensifies as the political climate gets worse, lobbying Congress and the administration. So here's a picture from the March for America, and you had these big screens in the back. So you had Luis Gutierrez speaking, one of the major advocates for immigration reform and for the rights of immigrants. But like I said, there was also videotape message by the president, once again, supposedly, recommitting himself to bringing about immigration reform. In response to pressure from advocates, in 2011, Department of Homeland Security finally announced in the so-called Morton memo that deportation would be prioritized. There's been a lot of critique because people are kind of swept up in these dragnets, right? You have these raids on the apple orchards, you have the raids on the dairy farms, you have roadblocks in Sodus, New York. Border Patrol was staking out a church because a service was held mass was held in Spanish, so there's all kinds of racial profiling going on. The bottom line is, this brings up their numbers, right? And Congress has allocated so much money to DHS, and that just happens to buy us the deportation of 400,000 people a year, right? So there is a quota system, even though officially the administration denies it, but they have to justify their budget. Otherwise, in the next round of budget allotment, they're not going to get as much funding. There was a lot of criticism that really only the most vulnerable people are swept up, but we're not catching terrorists with these methods. And the purpose of catching terrorists, I mean, that's the raison d'etre of Department of Homeland Security, right? And that's what initially they got their funding from. So there was this promise to prioritize, just deport dangerous criminals. But so far, administratively, only 1% to 2% of cases have been closed. And basically what that means is, this was just another empty promise, right? To get immigrants excited, to get the, Latino votes placated. In practice, there was really not as much happening as what was promised. Racial profiling continues. But besides advocacy groups working on this, we have a lot of really excellent documentaries that came out a few years ago. Abuse the Postville Raid, that deals mostly with Guatemalans working in a meatpacking factory in Postville, Iowa. And at the time, this was still under the previous administration. It was the largest ICE raid ever in U.S. history. It cost over $4 million. You had like hundreds of ICE agents involved in this. Ultimately, 280 some immigrant workers were detained, arrested, and ultimately deported. Right. So to deport like 200 some immigrants, a price tag of over $5 million. Also lost in detention. So you had some PBS documentaries, and some of these actually led to investigations. For example, congressional representatives then demanding that the Government Accountability Office investigate the practices of Department of Homeland Security. So there are some good things that came out of it. I'm going to send around 3 reports: Amnesty International, Jailed Without Justice, about immigrant detention, In Hostile Terrain, looking at enforcement, and then Justice Derailed, which specifically looks at the boarding of trains and buses as it happens here. So these are some of the reports. I think what is important, especially for those of you who want to become teachers, is to understand that statistically, right, and I'm averaging this out across the nation, if you have a classroom of 30 kids, at least one is either undocumented or has undocumented family members. In a state like New York, that's going to be higher, right? So you need to be sensitive to the fact that these kids are dealing with all kinds of psychological pressures related to that, right? That's really going to make their educational experience a lot more difficult. And this is just one of the reports, Shattered Families. There are a whole host of other ones, and another one, Facing Our Future. If you're interested, I have a whole host of reports. I'd be happy to email you. So in terms of immigrant rights groups, New York Immigration Coalition is one of the ones I work with. Northern Border Coalition I also work with. No More Deaths, right, on the border, trying to deal with that issue. United We Dream, working on the DREAM Act specifically. So in New York State, what advocates have accomplished. Last year, Governor Comer suspended the state's participation in ESCOM, and that was huge. The state of Illinois was first, right? So you have like a handful of states who said, we are not going to collaborate with ICE if they racially profile, right? Our police is only allowed to ask people about their papers if it is in the context of a criminal investigation, right? New York, we're not going to be Arizona when it comes to this stuff, right? Of course, shortly after the governor announced that, an announcement came from Department of Homeland Security saying, you know what, we don't care if you guys want to opt out, no one can opt out. Everybody has to be in, right? So it's this power struggle going on. On a local level, like on a county level, town, city, we've had a lot of ordinances passed, again, directing local police to not collaborate with ICE unless it is really a legitimate, law enforcement concern. In New York, we did pass our version of the DREAM Act, meaning undocumented immigrants can pay in-state tuition, right, which is a huge deal. In most of the states, they have to pay out-of-state tuition, which basically closes the door to education to many of them. And right now, there is a state law that was just introduced a few months ago, and that may be voted on as early as next January in the next session, and that would also give state tuition assistance such as TAP to undocumented immigrants, right? So we're going to take it a step further here. Needless to say, free law clinics, we continue to have them, and most recently for DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. What deferred action is, it quite simply puts a pause on your possibility of being deported, right? If you qualify, the government says, for the next 2 years, we're not going to deport you. That's all it does. It does not give you a green card. It does not give you access to legal status, but it does say for 2 years, we're not going to deport you. If you qualify, you could get a work permit, right? So this could benefit up to 2 million people. It just went into effect August 15th, and that's what I was mentioning earlier on, right? This is an executive action, and the president felt pressured by advocates to do this, and he did that because Congress refused to work together with him on comprehensive immigration reform. So grassroots efforts, very, very important. In Chicago, on the day it went into effect, 10,000 immigrants showed up and got in line for the workshop to see if they could process paperwork and kind of at least get some reprieve. Thousands of immigrants showed up in New York City, all across the country, right, especially in the main areas. So the current situation is this. Immigration debate is extremely polarized, and it gets that way especially before elections, right? But it's generally polarized anyhow. There's a lot of misinformation out there. Sadly, the deaths on the border continue to rise, even though the overall numbers of people coming across is down right now. And very disturbingly, hate crimes are up as well, right? You have a whole bunch of vigilante groups, especially down south. There's recently a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center that chronicles some of that. DACA is not enough, right? It's an executive action. Really what we need is comprehensive immigration reform. And the DREAM Act, goes part way as far as I'm concerned, but also does not go far enough. So from my perspective, it is absolutely crucial that you get informed, that you stay informed, and that you get involved. And again, for those of you who are looking to become teachers, it's very important to be sensitive to that issue. Because, we do have a lot of undocumented people in this country. And it could be very easily fixed. From my perspective, the bottom line is we don't have enough visas. Okay, our visa caps are unrealistically low. This is a global problem. Globally, 200 million people are on the move and work in countries other than the country of their birth. Right? So to think that we can keep people out by building a wall, that's just a ridiculous notion. Right, and but there are ways in which we could address the problem, and one can only hope that we're going to become more sensible in the near future.
Thanks.
Thank you.